Hi, this is Chuck Stull from Kalamazoo College, Law and Economics. I'm looking over some of the economic concepts that we've discussed over this past few weeks. And one of the things that I'd like you to note is as we move from our beginning, we're adding more reality, and that's adding more complexity. So we started by examining our simple market where we had no externalities, and in that case, free markets will lead to a socially optimal outcome. So we have the benefits shown in the demand curve, people's willingness to pay. We have the cost of production shown in the supply curve, the marginal cost, and free markets should bring us to an equilibrium where we maximize the total value to society, maximize the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So that gave us an argument for laissez-faire policy. Right? No rules needed. Markets should work on their own, given the assumptions we started with. We then moved to the case of externalities, where there was a cost imposed on a third party. And we looked at some classic examples using air pollution. Right, so there is harm caused, and that will lead to an inefficient outcome because not all of the costs are being included or considered by the decision makers. Right, so we have a difference between the supply curve and what the firm actually pays, or the social cost and the firm's costs. And that's going to lead to an equilibrium market quantity that is higher than the optimal quantity. And that's going to lead to inefficiency, as shown by the deadweight loss in this diagram. And then there is a role for policy to give us more efficient economic outcomes. And we have a variety of policy options that we could use. We could regulate the quantity of pollution. We could use an emissions fee, what's sometimes known as a Pigouvian tax. We're charging a dollar amount for each unit of emissions. Or we could subsidize cleanup, and all of those will give us a more efficient outcome. Right? So we've added some reality, but we've added some complexity. Our next big step was to look at Coase, and Coase introduces the idea of reciprocal externalities. Right? The cause of the external cost is joint. It is not just the steel mill, but it is the neighbors who are in proximity. And the policy then becomes more complicated. Right? So when the problem is caused jointly, it means that we could regulate or control either of the parties. Right? So who should change their actions? Should it be the polluter, or should it be the people who are damaged by pollution? And ideally what we want as economists is to find the lowest cost solution. So in some cases that might be to stop the emissions. In other cases it might be to move the neighbors. Now Coase does suggest a fairly straightforward policy response, and that is that if parties can bargain freely and there are no transaction costs, as long as the government assigns rights to one side or the other, they will be able to reach a private negotiation to come to the efficient or lowest cost solution. And that's the Coase theorem. Right? Coase theorem, we can reach the efficient solution no matter who has the initial rights. We then added another complication, the idea of transactions costs. So these can be any kind of friction, any kind of barrier to reach an agreement. And if that is the case, the Coase theorem will not work in every case. So we looked at a simple example where we have, again, some damage this time being done to multiple parties. And what happens is that the Coase theorem will not necessarily get us to the low-cost, efficient solution. So if we have multiple parties We can have a free rider problem if those people are asked to voluntarily contribute to ask the firm to reduce pollution. We could have the holdout problem where if the firm needs to make an agreement with every individual around it, it will not be able to necessarily get over the holdout problem where some people hold out for a much higher dollar payment than the actual harm they have caused or that is caused to them. Or there could be other kinds of transactions costs that we did not explore in detail. But if we do have transactions cost, policy changes again. There is not a general solution. And the initial rights matter. We might get to the efficient solution or we might not. And so that means we may need to look back to other policies in order to reach an efficient solution. We can't simply rely on private bargaining if there are transactions costs. We then added risk to the consideration, and many valuable economic activities do have uncertain outcomes. And particularly what we're looking at is that we have some outcomes that are bad, that are negative. We could have accidents from working or driving, and those do impose real costs on society. So we're looking at these risky actions or this dangerous behavior. We want to consider both the costs and the benefits. So there are real benefits from having a farmer grow food, even though there are risks. There are real benefits from having a truck move goods from one place to another, even though there are risks. And there are real costs and real benefits from manufacturing and nearly every kind of economic activity. So we can, in this case, use expected value, the summation of the probabilities times the value of the outcomes, sum of the P sub I times X sub I, to work with this. And then we can look at behavior and consider the benefits and the expected costs. If the benefits are less than the expected costs, we would want to put a restriction on that behavior. It would not be economically efficient. On the other hand, if the benefits are large compared to the expected cost, then there are net gains to society. So policy here suggests that we could use two different types of rules to solve this kind of dangerous behavior or restrict the appropriate, to restrict actors to the appropriate level. And one is to use an ex ante rule. So this would be, a charge for engaging in the risky behavior. Right? So it would be a dollar amount for each hour driven or each hour worked. And that, if the dollar value is set appropriately, will mean that the actors won't engage in activities where the benefits are less than that charge. The other alternative is to charge an ex post payment, and this would be an afterwards rule, an ex post rule, and that would be to charge a much larger amount in the event that an accident happens. And those can be equivalent under ideal conditions. And both of those can get us to the efficient amount or the optimal amount of risk. There are, as we continue forward, other problems that may make that difficult. And we won't always have people acting in the best manner if any of these problems exist. And we looked at several different kinds of problems. Unobservable behavior makes an ex ante rule impossible to implement. Imperfect knowledge makes an ex post rule less effective because people will make the wrong calculations. If the people who are engaged in the risky behavior don't have the ability to pay that big ex post punishment, that will again not give them the right incentive to act. And then monitoring and enforcement. If those are imperfect, we may also have problems with those rules. So the policy conclusions here is we don't have a general solution. Neither ex ante nor ex post rules work perfectly. Sometimes one is better, sometimes the other is better. And we really would need to know much more about the specifics and the specific costs and problems before we could move forward. We then moved on to the difficult issue of compensation. Property compensation tends to be relatively simple, but if we're looking at injury and wrongful death, it becomes much more complicated. So one of the things we need to do is to put a value on human life, and this is a problem that is difficult both conceptually, philosophically, and mathematically. But we do need a dollar value here. If we put an infinite value on human life, the economy can't operate. We can't have any trucks, we can't have any cars, we can't have any farming, we can't have any manufacturing. There is no way to bring risk to zero, which we would want to do if the value of an individual's life was an infinite amount. But on the other hand, if we ignore the value of life, if we set it to zero, if we say we can't put a price on it, then that means we're going to see too much dangerous behavior. So economists have spent quite a bit of time looking at different ways they could estimate how people value their lives. One way is to use revealed preference. What are people willing to pay to reduce risk? Right? What are they willing to pay for safety? Or what are they willing to accept to take on a higher risk? If we look at either of those, if they are willing to pay to reduce the risk in their life, risk to their life, then we can say, well, the dollar value of that payment has to be at least equal to the value of their life times the probability of that they would be saved. On the other hand, if we look at their willingness to accept payment, we could then say, well, that dollar payment has to be greater than or equal to the probability of the risk they're taking times the value of their life, or else they wouldn't willingly take it. In either of those cases, we can then implicitly value humans' life by looking at these payments that they are willing to take and dividing by the probability of the risk that they are either accepting or eliminating. Right? So it becomes just a calculation. There are a variety of possible ways we could resolve risk in this situation. It is possible that in some situations, and these are the kinds of situations that would bring us to those risk calculations, to those value of life calculations, is that private negotiation can work and say, will you accept this risk of taking this more highly risky job? And here's the probabilities, here is the extra pay. Or would you be willing to buy this particular safety device, and here's how much it would reduce your chance of being killed. But when we have things like people driving through a city or driving on a highway where there are hundreds or thousands of different individuals, to try and make those negotiations is impossible due to transaction cost. So in terms of the impact on policy, we need to think about compensation in two parts. One is trying to make the injured party whole, trying to bring them back to where they were. And the second, and from an economic perspective, more important way, is to give the appropriate incentives to take care to the damaging party or the party engaged in the risky behavior. Because if they have to pay for damages that they cause, they have an incentive to be more careful, to take precautions. One way to do this is to use liability rules, saying that if someone is hurt or someone's property is damaged, they can't stop the behavior itself, but they are entitled to compensation. And so a liability rule is a weaker protection than a property protection, but it is one that can work and it does reduce transactions costs. And insurance can also be a way to solve some of the issues related to large dollar payments and inability to pay, as well as risk aversion, where people might be unwilling to take the risk to do something valuable if there was such a large potential payment at the end. Thank you guys for listening. This is Chuck Stull from Kalamazoo College.